here to offer his perspective on the international situation and how it reflects in terms of our own domestic politics. Joining us from Philadelphia, our good friend, political consultant, political analyst, and WPHT talk show host, Dick Morris. Dick, we welcome you back to America's Forum.
Well, it's good to be here.
Now, Dick, Chuck Hagel said the U.S. has a role to play, but it is a limited role. Okay, we'll take that as a given. But what about the whole prospect of arming the Kurds? Why was that not done earlier?
Well, God knows why it wasn't done earlier. This is a Sunni Shiite fight, and the Kurds are not in it, and they deserve protection. They're not aggressors in any sense. But I want to get back to the fundamental point of asking for Iraq to broaden its government to a tripartite government, including Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds, just like we did in Bosnia, where Bill Clinton had the Serbs, the Bosnians, and the Croatians in a three-way government. And the idea was that with all three equal, nobody was resentful. The war that had cost almost 500,000 casualties didn't renew. And after 10 years or so, they wanted to get into the European Union. The Europeans said, we can't do three governments. And they said, scrap it, let's just have one government. And they've been getting along fine. We should have insisted on that solution for Iraq before we dropped those two 500-pound bombs. Obama's only leverage here is military intervention. And as long as he's surrendered that, played that card, he's not going to be able to hold back and demand real concessions.
Well, there's something else, it seems to me, entering into the equation, Dick, and that is the persecution, the extermination of Christians and other non-Muslims there in northern Iraq. So there is a humanitarian aspect and an imperative to try and stop that. Was that not also part of the calculus?
Well, that's where I think Obama made a big mistake. You can have your Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense go out and say, we have a limited role to play. But they can't say that after the President of the United States went on the air and said there were all these starving women and children dying of thirst on top of a mountain, and nobody's coming to their aid, and now we're coming to their aid. And then we say, oh, no, just two bombs, no more, no ground troops. We're not really coming to their aid. By giving that full-throated humanitarian expression, Obama really put his head in a noose. Because he can't, on the one hand, say this is a humanitarian imperative, but then on the other hand say there are very limits as to what we're going to do. And he should have thought of that before he made his statement, rather than having the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense trying to backfill after he made it. That's just the example of the incompetence of this president. Bill Clinton was always careful to measure his rhetoric in the situation so he would not overcommit and lead to mission creep. And when we read Obama's statement about getting involved, I was just appalled.
Well, the other, whether it was appalling, it certainly was interesting. Before going on vacation, the president called in Thomas Friedman of the New York Times in an attempt to offer some insights into his current thinking on foreign policy. Let's take a listen to what our president had to say, and then, Dick, I want to get your reaction.
I think what the Iranians have done is to finally realize that a maximalist position by the Shias inside of Iraq is over the long term going to fail. And that's, by the way, a broader lesson for every country. If you want just 100%, and the notion is that the winner really does take all the spoils, sooner or later that government's going to break down.
So, Dick, the president in lecture mode, has he learned anything in terms of foreign policy?
No. He just made the point I made, which is that you need a tripartite solution. But you should have had that before we pulled our troops out of Iraq, and then because we messed that one up, you should have had that before we renewed bombing. To insist on it now, when the president is committed to a humanitarian rescue of these folks and has already broken the line and actually bombed, is to make a demand after you've lost all leverage, and to hope that the Iranians somehow are spontaneously going to realize this and make up for his own failure of leadership, typifies what's wrong with his foreign policy.
Dick, thus far in our conversation, when you've mentioned the name Clinton, you've made sure we understand you were talking about Bill Clinton. Let's move to Mrs.
Right.
Clinton. It appears that Hillary is really trying to distance herself from President Obama. When asked about the Obama foreign policy, she said, and I quote, "Great nations need organizing principles and don't do stupid stuff." Or don't do stupid stuff is not an organizing principle. Dick, that prompts another question. Hillary was Secretary of State. Why didn't she influence the Obama foreign policy? Now she's speaking up after the fact.
Yeah, well, let's bifurcate this analysis and first look at the substance of what Hillary is saying and then the politics of it. The substance of the break with Obama is over whether we should have armed the Syrian rebels earlier. And that's a ridiculous proposition. The ISIS forces we are fighting in Iraq are fighting back with our weapons that either we gave them when the Iraqi army surrendered or through the aid to Syria. It was impossible to distinguish moderate, constructive, secular, democratic elements from jihadist extremists. And even if you could segregate them at the beginning, once combat starts, the arms flow every way. And the idea that we could have armed the moderates and they could have retained the extremists is simplistic and just impossible. Now, politically, what she's trying to do is she's got a very difficult task. On the one hand, she wants to run on her record at the State Department because she doesn't really have any other record. Her record in the Senate was minimal, nothing major. And in the White House, she was there for 8 years, but as my wife famously said, so was the pastry chef. On the other hand, while she's trying to run on her record in the State Department, she's trying to run away from it by distancing herself from Obama's foreign policy as it crashes and burns for us all to see. I think that what she's trying to do is to adopt a more bellicose position and move to the right of Obama. That assumes she's not going to have a primary. And I think what Hillary is doing by her wealth, by her contributions, by her overt affair with Goldman Sachs, her PAC is having a fundraiser this week at Corzine's home, the guy who lost $3 billion or $1.5 billion. And all of this and this bellicose foreign policy is opening the door to a primary fight. And just because there's no candidate out there now doesn't mean that politics will tolerate such a vacuum.
As you mentioned that, it's interesting to take a look at a column that David Brooks wrote along the same lines about Mrs. Clinton and foreign policy. Here's the pull quote from that column. Mrs. Clinton speaks as a Truman Kennedy Democrat. She's obviously much, much more multilateral than Republicans, but there's a certain muscular tone, a certain assumption that there will be hostile ideologies that threaten America. I don't know if you agree with the finer points of that, but you're saying that that stance guarantees at least a challenge or maybe multiple challenges for Hillary from the left?
Well, it did last time. 2008, Obama challenged her over her bellicose position on Iraq, her support for the Iraq war, and her voting for that resolution. So that triggered a primary challenge, and this might well do so as well. But Hillary is not the person who can claim to wage a broad war against jihadism. Huma Abedin, her chief travel aide, her more or less chief assistant, has links to the Muslim Brotherhood. Longtime employees of the Clinton Foundation do as well. Bill has given paid speeches from the government of Qatar, which is sponsoring Hamas, for Saudi Arabia, for all of the nations that are funding terrorism. And Hillary's distancing herself from jihad and saying this should be the organizing principle of our foreign policy, or implying that, is really going to have a lot of accusations blowing back at her.
Well, we'll see if she is able to have it both ways. And as you mentioned, in 2008, she did not survive those challenges. It remains to be seen if she in fact will get in the race and just how effective a candidate she can be in 2016. As always,
Well, you have my rule for determining whether she gets in the race, right? If she has a pulse, that'll tell you.
all right. Dick has already flipped over the cards. He guarantees she's running in 2016. I guarantee, Dick, that we'll revisit the topic in the not-too-distant future. As always, Dick Morris,
she has a pulse.
thanks so much for your time. We sure do appreciate it. That's Dick Morris's take. What's yours? Why don't you tweet me your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum.